Hey guys, so I want to make an updated video on making presets in Sampler. I think I gave you some pretty good tips in the first one, but in having conversations with another Ableton friend of mine who's doing something pretty similar, I've come across a number of other tips that might save you time and just get you into the flow of doing this. If you're going to put together several presets from another instrument or something. Like I said before, in some cases the advantages of doing this are I can make a collection of sounds that are only available on the PC when I use my Mac or vice versa. And another thing is once I've set it up in Sampler and I use that in my songs, it's much easier for me to share that with other Ableton users. So let's get into some of the basics here and some of the things that I'm actually changing. You know, as I learn this process a little bit, there's certain recommendations that are a little different. For example, in the last video I told you, you know, go ahead and make each sample 1 bar long, and I'm still cool with that, but I had my tempo down to 90 BPM, and depending on how much memory you have that you can use, if you've got complex sounds, you should bring the tempo all the way down to 20. And you don't have to use it all, but this gives you a lot more flexibility. And I found that I had to get rid of some of my presets because I just didn't get enough sound. The sound hadn't evolved to a place that made it easy for me to create a repeating loop. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So the first thing, I'll retrace some of my steps before. You can set as many steps as you want. For me, I'm doing 17 different steps, so different ranges. So basically each range is a half an octave for me. So I start at C0 and then I go up half an octave every bar, all the way up to C8. So C8 will take from that note all the way above, and this note here will take everything from C0 below. So once we've set this here, what we want to do is we want to go into our sound and we want to make sure that we drop the release all the way to 0 or to 1 millisecond. Whatever synth that you're using, you should be able to get the release and drag it all the way down. That means that when the note is done playing, it's just going to stop immediately instead of carrying over. So second I let go, it stops, which is great because these are going all the way across and then the next note picks up right away. So we don't want carryover. So anyway, that's how we're doing this. The next thing we do after we get all of our release times down as low as they can go is we'll go ahead and right click and freeze the track. Now in my first video I tell you to go and right click and flatten the track, and that works pretty well, but you might want to have reference to this original MIDI track if you make any mistakes or something and you need to go back to that original part. It's kind of nice to have it. So another suggestion I can make is to duplicate this frozen track and then just drag it to an audio track, and now you've got both the MIDI and the audio together. The next step that I'm going to have you take is drag this loop all the way to the beginning here, because what it does is it doubles the time to try to make a seamless loop going around, but you don't really need that. So just grab that loop section and grab this here at the end, which ends the sample, and it keeps the length 17 bars long, which is what you want. And from there you want to right click and slice to new MIDI track. From here, what you'll notice here is the longest divider that you can go by is 1 bar. So that's why I've slowed this all the way down to 20, but I left this at 1 bar instead of making like a 2 bar part for each note, because this makes it much faster. So set it to a bar, and then set this to slice to single sampler, and then just hit OK. And now it gives us our 17 slices here, and it sets it up in our sampler, not exactly the way we want it, but it gets all the notes inside a new sampler. So the next thing that we'll want to do is hit Command A to highlight all these, and then we will drag all these across like so. So the next thing you'll want to do once you've highlighted all of these, let me highlight them again, is you want to set the first note here to the first sampled note. And in this case, as we can remember from this, our first sampled note is C0. And then the end, we want it set to the range that we're planning on having, which is half a bar. So we would start the last note at C8 and then go half a bar in, which would bring us to F8. And then we will right click and distribute ranges equally. And this should set each one alternating from a C note to an F sharp, C, F sharp, all the way through. So that's a big time saver there. You don't have to go through the process I showed you last time of copying the audio file, making your own slices, and then dragging it in here. Next thing is this also saves time on the root note. So what I will do here is I will come in to our sampler area, find our root note, and then I want to drag the root note to the beginning of each part. Now if you want, you could have the root note in the middle if you would like, and in that case, but you still want the root note to be on the C note or the F note. In this case, I'm just going to use this down here, and then we'll drag, and as you can see, it will drag all of them to the beginning of the note, all the way up and all the way down. So that's solved that quickly, which is really great. That's a big time saver, and believe me, I spent a lot of time not doing that, so I hope that little tip helps. The guy that helped me learn this, I'm going to make sure you follow him because he's a really cool guy. The next thing that I want to get into is loop ranges. And if you come down here to the bottom, you'll notice the red line that's kind of going across. Okay. So what I notice is the sound evolves here, and it kind of chills out right in here, and then it kind of evolves again. So what I want to do is I actually want to set a loop. Now sometimes you want to use a back and forth loop, which I did in the other video, and that seems to work for me, and I might use it for this. But in other cases, sometimes you'll find that the forward loop sounds more smooth. So let's start with this, the front and back. And then I'm just going to set a loop level here. So when we play it, it's just going to loop this back and forth. So this just gives us a basic starting point. Okay, so we've got something that sounds fairly steady, but there's little clicks on the end, and this is going to be your nemesis when you're making these presets. So there's a few different options, and not one works for everything. So as you come in closer, you may notice like a a pattern here, and you can kind of bring yourself to a different pattern. Now this doesn't sound too bad right now. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of tweak the end loop, and then we'll tweak the loop start as well and see if we can get things happening. If that doesn't work, then we'll go into the crossfade. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm just trying to change the end loop and listening for the clicks, listening for if it gets any better or gets any worse. Now, I've tried using the snap on, which is supposed to set it to the 0 point, and I haven't really noticed much of a difference, on the clicks. It's kind of odd in the way that things are set. So the placement might not seem all that intuitive, but you're just going to have to use your ears on this one. And I could keep kind of going through cycles and trying to find if I can get it, but it seems like this is not going to be super easy to do. So the next thing is using the crossfade. The thing you want with the crossfade is you want the clicks to go away, but you don't want it to create a volume slope, or at least a noticeable one. So sometimes you start with a small crossfade and see if you can get rid of those clicks. So now there's like a flange or something. So what I'll do is I'll start by bringing it a little bit lower to see if I can make it more subtle and still get the right effect. This is a really good example because since this was a tough one, we're probably going to be using all the techniques that I have available. So if that's happening, and as you bring the crossfade up, you're starting to get that flange or kind of a volume drop in the sound. Surprisingly, if you bring the crossfade up higher in the 10, 20, 30, even 40 or 50,000 range, it can actually give you better results or smoother results in some cases. So I'm going to go ahead and try that. So that still has like kind of a back and forth movement, but sometimes you're looking for what's most acceptable in a sound. In this case, this would probably be fine for me, unless I wanted to go through and really check the loop start and loop end of a sound. I could also try doing a forward loop and see if that makes any difference for me. And that's the problem sometimes with the forward loop. When it crosses over, the transition of the sound is not very smooth. So sometimes you can move this down a little bit and try to get a tighter loop, but you don't want it to sound like a loop. So I find when that happens, it's better to kind of do a back and forth, and it at least makes that modulation smoother. So anyway, that's some extra tips on doing that. It's not the most pleasant, but if you want to get the job done right, those are the tips that you can use for that. So let's move on to the next section of preset making. And that is when you're doing multiple presets. And obviously what you would do with this is you would copy this and then you could paste it into a sampler instrument that you've already done if you want. And you could simply do that just by copying and pasting. And there you would have your deal, and you could assign your macros and everything to that. Okay, so the one thing I want to mention about doing the slice to new MIDI track and slicing to a sampler is the one disadvantage of that is with the macros. That would mean that you could of course copy and paste your sampler instrument and all these settings, and you know that'll save you some time, and you could drop it into your you know, whatever your instrument rack is here, and you know, add it to your chain. But the problem with that is that you're not going to have your macros all set up. See, if I copy, for example, this pad sound to create another pad, right? So I'll just duplicate this here. Now I've got a new one that's just like the last one. And then what I will want to do is go to the sampler zone. And in this case, I've got empty pads set up. So this is awesome. And as you can see, all the macros are already set up. So the trade-off is if you want this already set up, which I kind of suggest you do, then instead of doing the right click and slice to sampler, you do the old trick of grabbing this here, copy, and pasting it over here, and with several other presets so that you save time, go through the process of making your own cuts on the grid. I could drag this into an empty sampler, and as you can see, the macros are already set up and ready to go, as you can see over here. And then I'll drag them in and follow the whole process that I showed you here. You know, the trick with this is really get your first preset set up your macros for your first one, duplicate that, and then just rename it like, you know, empty track or whatever, the duplicate, and then do Command or Control A and just delete all the samples in the copy so that this now becomes a blank track. And then you could duplicate that several times, and then you just drag these into empty slots, but all the macro settings will be all ready to go. So what I like to do is also set the mod wheel to vibrato. So usually what I'll do is I'll select LFO1 volume and LFO1 pitch amount. And what I do is I set both of these to 100%, but I come into the mod section and then I set the maximum amount of pitch and volume that I would want. So I turn my mod wheel all the way up, and I obviously want it more subtle than that, so I bring this down to about 14% just to give it a little more variation. And I don't want it to sound completely choppy for the vibrato, so I bring this up to 80%. And then once it's assigned to here, it depends on the mod wheel on the amount that the sound will have. So hopefully that didn't bury you with too much information, but if you're looking to make presets, I just want to save you as much time as you can, because it is definitely a process, a definite learning experience. So this will give you a more complete type of idea of, you know, what it takes to create presets. A final tip that I'd like to leave you guys with when it comes to making presets in Sampler, or just in using Sampler in general, especially if you have sounds that have a slow release. Sometimes you might find yourself getting this type of result where the sound's getting cut off when you replay it. Sometimes that can be a desired effect, but oftentimes it just sounds kind of clicky. and it kind of cuts off the flow. In order to keep that from happening, you want to remove this or unclick this re-trigger button here, and that will give you a much smoother sound. Just like so, no clicking off. Yeah, if you're finding that happening, thanks to many of my Twitter friends for showing me that. Solved a lot of problems, so I hope that helps the rest of you that don't know that tip.